Hi everyone, Crista Cowan here with another episode of the Barefoot Genealogist. Today we are going to do something a little bit different, and it's the first time I've tried this, and so I don't know how it's going to work. So bear with me, but we're going to talk about brick walls today. It's a phrase that we use a lot in genealogy, which just usually means that we have reached the end of our ability to solve a particular research problem. I get emails, hundreds of emails every single day where people say, I've got this brick wall and here's what I'm trying to solve, or here's what I'm trying to find out. And so I was going to walk you through two case studies today. That was the plan when I put the calendar together. But as I started putting the presentation together, I realized that maybe it would be best if we just focused on one today so that I could give you some really specific steps. One of the things that I've discovered is that I do these presentations and I provide you with some information. And sometimes one of the challenges that we have as learners is understanding how the principles that we've discussed connect or apply to my specific problem. And so very often I'll do a presentation and then I'll get on chat afterwards. And what I'll discover is that you're asking me questions that I already answered or that I just answered in the presentation. And it's not because you weren't listening or paying attention. It's because sometimes we just struggle a little bit to apply principles in a practical application setting. And so today what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you some principles about how to break through your brick walls. And I want you to pay attention to that, but then I'm going to use a very specific example from one of you to help show how I apply those principles. And just because I'm not talking about your specific problem doesn't mean that it won't work. And I hope that makes sense to some of you. I teach at a local university, and sometimes I have to walk through this with my students as well. Just because we're talking about this doesn't mean it doesn't apply to you and your situation. You just have to somehow figure out or maybe work a little harder to make that connection. So that's what we're going to do today. If this goes well, and if this is something that is of interest to you, then we may make this a regular feature where I walk through how to solve. I don't solve it, but walk through how to solve a particular problem or what effort might be required to do that. So that was a really long intro, and actually I just have a couple more things to talk about before we dive into our presentation. Let's talk about this phrase brick wall for just a minute. One of the things that I've discovered is that very often we create our own brick walls. We start with a pile of bricks that maybe we've tripped over, and then we start building this wall until we can't get through it ourselves. Sometimes it's because we're new and we don't know any better. Sometimes it's because we're trying to force a certain ancestor to fit into our pedigree. Sometimes it's because we've just grabbed the first person that looks like they might match, and maybe that isn't even a real person, or maybe it's a composite of several people. And so sometimes we create our own brick walls. I tell you that just to kind of open up your mind, get you thinking a little bit about ways in which you might have done that. The other thing that I frequently see, and I may be a little guilty of it myself, is at the first sign of resistance, or at the first hint that this might be a little bit of a difficult research challenge, I throw up my hands and I say, oh, this is a brick wall. I'm never going to solve it. Somebody solve this for me. And it's because I'm frustrated, or I don't know what I don't know, or I want somebody else to do it for me. Lots of different reasons. And so one of the things that I sometimes feel like is when we say we have a brick wall, really what it is it's like we've taken a sheet of butcher paper and drawn a brick wall on it, right? It really isn't a brick wall. I'm a little weird. You're going to figure that out. I have images in my head of high school football games, and you know how the cheerleaders will line up and make a little human tunnel, and then they'll hold up that big piece of paper so that the football players can burst through it. That's the image I have in my head of the brick walls that we sometimes say we have, where it really isn't a brick wall at all. It's just something we could break through probably fairly easily with a little bit of guidance or information, or with a little bit of effort. So with all of that said, let's go ahead and dive into what I have prepared for you today so that we can get you solving your own brick wall challenges. Again, just keep in mind this imagery of whether or not you really have a brick wall or not. Also, just be aware that some of the world's largest brick walls have come tumbling down with some patience and some persistence, with some additional information. So don't get discouraged. There are a lot of ways that you can get over or around or dig under that brick wall if you can't burst through it. And hopefully today will start you thinking about some of the ways in which you can do that. Like I said, we may make this a regular feature with additional tips along the way if this works out well. So if you've watched me before, you know that this is not new information. These are two questions that I ask myself constantly when I am doing genealogy research. What do I know and what do I want to know? To be able to answer those questions very clearly, very succinctly, and very specifically is a huge key to my success in genealogy research. Now, there are a few supplemental questions there. It's not just what do I know, but how do I know it? Do I know it because grandma said so? Do I know it because I found it on a single census record? Do I know this information because I've collected every single record that could possibly exist about this person, and I have used that to come to some conclusions, right? You can see those three things are very different. So what do you know, but how do you know it? And then the next step is, what do you want to know? And the supplemental to that is, where could you find that information? And that becomes really important as well, right? Not just what do you want to know, but maybe start to brainstorm where you could possibly find information. And like I said, we'll look at a specific case study here so that you can start to make some of these connections. But that last question there on your screen, I spend probably as much time researching what exists as I do actually looking for a person, right? So I don't just dive in always and start searching, by plugging in the name of the person on Ancestry.com and start searching. I very frequently will search, I'll do Google searches, I'll do Ancestry wiki searches, I'll look in the card catalog, I will look up the catalog on the state archives website. Like, I'll do lots of research into what records even exist, many times far before I start looking for my person in those records. And there are a few reasons for doing that. One of the most important for me is I don't want to waste time looking for a birth record, for example, if no birth records were kept in the time and place when my ancestor lived. That's just going to frustrate me. The other reason that I do that is because I want to become so familiar with the records and with what exists and what doesn't exist, so that when I do go looking for my person, I have some clue as to whether or not I've really found my person, right? The more I know about the records, the more I know about the frequency of a surname in a given location, the more I know about, what the family structure is, the more I know, right? The more easily or readily I'm able, when I find a record, to say, yes, this is my person, or no, this is his cousin who has the same name and was born 3 years earlier, or no, this is another family living in that same town who happens to have the same surname, but as far as I can tell, they're not related. So lots of time, I spend time researching records as opposed to researching people. Hopefully that makes some sense to you. If it doesn't, it's okay. Just bear with us, hang in there, you'll figure it out, okay? So a couple of words of advice that I would give you, and then we'll look at our specific example and how this applies. The first thing is, back up a generation and review everything you know. So what we're doing is we're just taking those two questions: what do you know and how do you know it? And where could you possibly find that information that you need to know? Here's just kind of how I apply this. Back up a generation and review everything you know and how you know it. Have you collected all the information about this family? Not did you find them on one 1880 census record and call it good, but have you traced the family through every census record? Have you looked in newspapers? Have you looked for birth, marriage, and death records? Have you checked Find a Grave for tombstone records? Or tombstone photos? Have you looked at military records? I mean, there's a lot of different kinds of records. Have you collected everything you can about the family? And then the second question, and this is one that trips up a lot of people. Have you collected information about all the members of the family? not just all the information, but everyone in that family. Very, very often, as I look at other people's family trees, or as people come to me for help, one of the questions that I'll ask or look at is, do they have everybody in the family listed? If you're looking for your great-grandfather's parents and you don't know anything about his siblings, right, that's a way to back up a generation and maybe figure some more stuff out. If you're looking for a woman's maiden name and you only know the name of the one child that you descend from, that's a way to back up a generation and make sure you've collected information about all of the members of this family. Because your great-grandmother may not have her mother's maiden name listed on her death certificate, but 3 of her brothers might. And so that entire family view becomes really critical to breaking through some of these brick wall problems that we have. Okay, second piece of advice or second strategy that I use, besides backing up a generation, what I will do is I will create a timeline of the important dates and places in the lives of this family that I'm researching, right? So I'll make a list of the year and place where, and I do this usually just in a spreadsheet, and this is not something I do for every family that I encounter. Usually it's just when I'm trying to solve a problem. This is one of the strategies I use. So I'll create a timeline like in a spreadsheet where I just list, the date and the place and the event. So, on November 27th, 1843 in Fulton County, Georgia, the father of this family was born. And then, in about 1847 in Alabama, the mother of this family was born. And I estimate that they were married in about this year. And here's the birth dates of each of their children and where those children were born. And then the reason I use a spreadsheet is because it allows me just really easily to insert a line if I need to and say, okay, well, here I found them in this census living in this place. And I found them in this census living in this place. And I found a death record for one of their children in this place. And what that does for me is that it helps me just to really readily look down a column and say, you know what, there's something out of order here. Did they really move from Georgia to Alabama to Texas back to Alabama? Or maybe I've got a wrong record. Or maybe I started tracing the wrong family. Maybe I found a John Williams married to a Susan and assumed it was my John and Susan, only to mix them up with another John Williams and his wife Susan that were living in Texas. So it helps me really clearly to start to see where I may have created my own brick walls. If all the information jives, it starts to help me see where my gaps are. And then I do this. I start to include important dates in history. So for example, the Civil War, right? I'll drop that into my timeline. Or World War I, or the 1812 earthquake that hit the southern United States. I have a bunch of family that lived in Kentucky at the time, and all of a sudden, the entire community, pretty much, about, probably 30 or 40 families, many of whom were interrelated, just picked up and moved. And it was just kind of an odd thing, and I started looking into it, and turns out there was an earthquake. A pretty massive earthquake, and I imagine it probably freaked them out, and so they all picked up and moved. Things like that. Start to look for not just important dates that you might be aware of, but look for maybe events, local events, or things that you might not be aware of. Spend some time researching that history. Make a note of what records you found. I mentioned I'll plug in where they're living in a census, or a death of a child, or other records that I find. And then make a note of records you still need to locate. And that's an important step, right? If you have an approximate marriage date for a couple, well, what you're missing is an actual marriage record. Now, you've estimated that date, probably based on the age of the parents and the birth of that oldest child that you know of. But if you don't have a marriage record, make a note in the appropriate place on your little timeline. It helps just to see where you might find more information that will help you break through that brick wall or climb over it. So let's look at our specific case study now, just so that you get an idea of how I have applied some of these things to this specific problem. So, I already talked about this. Forgot I did a slide for it. Do some research into what records are available. So explore the Ancestry wiki and the card catalog. If you're not familiar with those, the wiki is found by hovering over the Learning Center, and you just go down here to Family History Wiki. And in the search box on this wiki, you can type in the name of any state in the United States in particular. It's really, because we're on Ancestry.com, the U.S. website, it's very heavily leans towards U.S. research. And so you can go and you can type in the name of any state, and it'll give you a vital records page that lists when that state or location started keeping records. The card catalog is going to be found under search. So again, I'm just moving my mouse. I'm not clicking until I get down here to card catalog. I can click on that and it will show me all of the records that Ancestry.com has online. So if I need to see if, the marriage records for the state of Maine in 1874 are online, I can just filter to Maine, marriages, 1870s, and it will show me if we have those records online or not. So spend some time with the Family History Wiki and with the wiki. Apparently it was having an issue. The Family History Wiki and with the card catalog. Just exploring them, getting familiar with what's available. Okay, now here is our specific research problem. So here's what I received in this email, right? I'm looking for my great-grandfather's parents, right? And I'm fairly certain this email used the words brick wall. I had to shorten it to fit it on the slide, so I have just extracted the important information here. Looking for my great-grandfather's parents. He was born in about 1872 in Missouri. He was married in about 1894 in Missouri or Oklahoma, and he died in 1967 in Arkansas. Okay, so they've included in this request information about what they know and what it is that they're looking for. However, remember our first tip is sometimes you have to go back a generation or come down a generation in order to go back a generation. Right, so very clearly stated here what they're looking for. My great-grandfather's parents. But in order to find out about them, you need to know more about your great-grandfather. Let me just show you some of the pertinent words in this request that flagged me to why there might be some more research that needs to be done here. Okay, the great-grandfather was born in about 1872, so there is no specific date. It says Missouri. It did not list a place in Missouri, so that might also be a question. He was married in about 1894 in Missouri, okay, or in Oklahoma. So not quite sure of which location, okay, not quite certain about the date. If I look at this date, 1894, compared to his birth date, 1872, for me that's a flag because for a really long time there was a practice in genealogy about estimating dates. And typically what was used was you would estimate that a man was about 22 years old and a woman was about 20 years old, and just plug that in just so you had a date or some kind of an estimation to work from. And that's fine. It works that way. And I've had a lot of success using that strategy, but it could be way off, right? They could have gotten married when he was 18 and she was 16. They could have gotten married when he was 35 and she was 24, right? So sometimes this date is, especially when there's an about in front of it, is just an estimation. And without any more information about how they estimated this, that leaves me with some questions. Now, if their oldest child was born in 1895, and if that had been included in this email, I might be able to say, okay, then very likely they were married sometime before 1895, and 1894 is as good a place as any to start looking for that marriage record, okay? The fact that we don't know exactly where they were born or where they were married leads me to some additional questions, right? Do we say Missouri because that's where he was born and that's why that's a possibility? Do we say Oklahoma because that's where their oldest child was born, right? This is where a timeline really comes in handy because you can start to see, was there migration? Were they living, where were they living specifically that may have been near a border of those two locations? So some of these ambiguous words, before we just dive into looking for his parents, We need to know more about him and his life. We need to make sure we're really solid on who this person is, where they fit in history, what the details of their life are. Now, there is a very definitive statement here. He died in 1967 in Arkansas. Boom, right? Like, that's pretty solid. There's no ambiguous words here. Now, again, because somebody obviously didn't want to provide me with a novel in a request, they may know more information. They may know a specific date or a specific place, and that's great. My question is, how do you know this information? How do you know his exact death date and place, but not his exact birth date, right? Did you just know this because you remember, because you were alive in 1967 and you were at his funeral? Do you know this because your mom gave you this information? Do you know this because you've seen a tombstone and the tombstone says he died in 1967 at the age of whatever, and you've estimated that birth date? So starting to look at why you know or how you know this information is really, really important, because it helps you see where your holes are, what further research you need to do. So let me just walk you through exactly what I would do with this information if it was me. Now, granted, this is limited information here, but here's kind of the process that I go through when I'm doing this kind of research. So based on this information, I would just start listing. Now, I'm not doing any research yet. I would just start listing the records I should be able to find for this person. I use census records as kind of the foundation for my research. Sometimes I'm able to find them all immediately. Sometimes I find 2 or 3 records for a person with the same name, and until I find more information, I don't know if I found the right person or not. So, for example, the 1880 census, if he was born in 1872, the 1880 census should be the first record he appears on, okay? So I actually went and looked for this person. The name was included. I just didn't include it on that slide. I actually went and looked for this person in the 1880 census based on the information that I got in that email. And I found 4 different men who could be him, right? One had, 2 of them had the same name. One of them had was going by a middle name that was the same. And then the third one just was listed, or the fourth one was just listed with his initials. So with just that information, I don't know enough to be able to say, this is him with his parents in the 1880 census, okay? So I put all 4 of those records into my shoebox. I didn't save them to my tree because I don't know which one he is, but I just saved each of those 4 census records to my shoebox. Okay. Now, the 1890 census, for those of you who are new to genealogy, it was destroyed in a fire, so it's missing. And so we have this huge 20-year gap that, especially for people who were born in the 1860s, 70s, 80s, is just, it's a real problem for us for our research, but there's ways around it. So then the 1900 census would be the next record I should find him on. I should find him on the census every 10 years from 1900 to 1940, probably listed with his wife and children through most of that. And sure enough, I did. I was able to find him on every one of these censuses listed with his wife and children. Okay? Now, that gives me a really good foundation for his life. And as a matter of fact, most of the information in these census records corroborated the information that I received in that email. He was probably married about 1894. He lived past 1940, so we've got that. I've got lists of information about his children. One of the clues that I almost always look for in census records are other family members living with them or around them. And in both the 1900 and the 1910 census, on the same page, there were 2 other families in 1900 and one in 1910 that have the same last name on the same page and are about the right age to be brothers of this man, right? So I still don't know who his parents are. Remember, that's the problem I'm trying to solve. But now I have a clue about who 2 of his brothers might be. Okay, now I went back to the 1880 census then with that information, and sure enough, one of those men had 2 brothers with the same name as the men who were listed on the same page in the 1900 census. So now I'm fairly certain, with just doing census work, that I've discovered the right family. Now, that doesn't mean that there are not more records to find just to validate and to corroborate your information. So the first thing I might look for is a birth record. One of the things that I know, because I've looked in the card catalog, is that Missouri birth records are online for the mid-1800s. Now, some states didn't start keeping birth records at a state level until the early 1900s. Some until, I think, as late as 1937, I think, is the state that started keeping them the latest. But oftentimes those records were kept at a county level or at a local level, and you might have to actually write to the county. They might not be online. And so figure out if there were birth records kept in the time and place where your ancestor lived, and then check the card catalog to see if they're online. Now, marriage records, he was married in about 1894 in either Missouri or Oklahoma. Well, if he was married in Missouri, we're in luck, because those Missouri marriage records are online. If he was married in Oklahoma, that's a little bit more difficult. Oklahoma didn't start keeping marriage records at a state level until about 1907, if I remember correctly. And so I would likely need to know what county in Oklahoma they were living in at the time so that I could check with the county to see if there's a record of the marriage there. Because he was born in the 1870s and he was a male and he was alive in 1917 and 18, there should be a World War I draft card for him. That World War I draft card is likely to list his exact birth date and possibly where he was born as well. It might also list if his father was foreign born or a U.S. citizen. So, and then sometimes it'll list, it always will list their employer. And very often what I find, especially in rural America in the 19-teens, is that many of these men were working for their parents. They were working on a family farm, and so they might list their father as their employer. And then, of course, I want to look for a death record. Now, a death certificate is going to be probably the best thing I could find. I checked the card catalog, and on Ancestry.com, we have the death index for the state of Arkansas. So the state of Arkansas has not given us copies of those certificates to put online, but we have been able to obtain an index to put online. So I could look up that 1967 death, get the information there about the date and the certificate number, and then I could write to the state of Arkansas to purchase a copy of that death certificate to have it mailed or emailed to me. That would likely provide, if the informant knew, the names of his parents. And not just their names, but his mother's maiden name might be included, and their birthplaces, or at least their birth states, might also be included. Now, I don't just want to look for the death record of my ancestor. Remember, all records about all family members. What about those two brothers, right? Remember those two brothers we found? Maybe if my ancestor doesn't have the maiden name of the mother listed on the death certificate, maybe one of those brothers does. And so those are the kinds of records that I want to make sure that I'm collecting. Now, don't just look for a death certificate. Maybe also check local newspapers for an obituary. Maybe the obituary has additional information about when and where he lived, more information about his parents, maybe information about which siblings survived him. Also, another type of a death record is a tombstone. Find out what cemetery they're buried in. Don't just look at the tombstone of your ancestor. Check the tombstones of the people buried around them. Very often you might find that it's a family plot or a family cemetery, and that the people surrounding them are actually siblings, cousins, maybe even his parents. Okay, so this is the process that I go through, and granted, I was trying to solve a problem with limited information, but remember the original question, we're going to have to go back through here. The original question was looking for my great-grandfather's parents. Well, rather than just dive in looking for the parents, solve the problem about when and where he was born, when and where he was married, get details about when he died. All of those will provide you with the clues necessary to then solve the problem about who the parents were. Now, let me just remind you before we wrap up here, for those of you who are new, you may not know this yet, and that's okay, but I'm going to tell you now. When you get your little shaky leaf hints, and we show you the records that we've found on Ancestry.com, that is not all that exists. I hope I said that correctly. We only show you those records under that shaky leaf. We only show you the records that we are fairly certain are for your person. So if we can tell with a great degree of certainty that this 1900 and 1910 and 1930 census are for your person, we're going to give you a hint or a shaky leaf that will lead you to those records, okay? If this 1880 record only lists him by his initials, his birth year is off by a year or two, and we can't tell whether or not it's your person, we're not going to give you a hint to that record. The only way you're going to find that record is by actually doing a search. I make a point of that because there are a lot of people who are new, and one of the things that I've heard quite a bit recently at conferences is, well, I've looked for this, this record hasn't come up. That's how it's often phrased. These are the only records I've been able to find. Well, did you do a search? Well, no, I just looked at the leaf. Okay, that's fine. That's to get you started. But creating this type of a list where you can list all the possible records you might find and then just check them off as you find them, then you know what records you still have to search for. And you do still have to search. Okay, hopefully that was helpful. Like I said, we only had time for one case study, even though I advertised two, just because I felt like we needed to be a little bit detailed today. Lots of new people joining our ranks every day, even those of us like myself who are, decades-long veterans of this sometimes need these reminders about exactly how we need to sometimes go back to the basics, look at what we know. Now, I have lots of other brick wall strategies, and so I think this went fairly well today. I'd appreciate your feedback, and as we talk in chat immediately following the presentation, or if you want to email me at the address there on your screen. And maybe we can make this a regular feature where we just talk through specific strategies for breaking through those brick walls as opposed to a how-to on the website. So until next time, this is Crista Cowan. Have fun climbing your family tree.